Tonight, we follow a simple question with a gentle pace. Were Egypt's curses punishments from the dead, or protections we have read the wrong way? In the West Bank at Thebes, tombs were built for order, not for fear. The ancients called that order mayat, balance that lets a traveller keep the road beyond life. A tomb was a guide, names repeated so a person would remain, food carved so the spirit would be fed, texts chosen like tools. Warnings at thresholds existed, but they read as courtesies. Move slowly, do no harm, remember that a door is a promise. Centuries later, sealed rooms opened, and a new word ran ahead of the notes: curse. After Tutankhamun's burial chamber was entered, a distant death and a handful of rumors became a pattern. Headlines arrived before explanations. The idea was strong, but the rooms themselves still spoke quietly, of guardians, star ceilings, shrines within shrines, and a plan meant to keep a single life intact. This journey will hold both frames at once. We will begin with Tutankhamun, where a small suite of rooms kept more memory than space. We will listen to another case often told in a louder voice, the screaming mummy, and read it with care. An open mouth may be ceremony interrupted, not terror preserved. We will meet Rameses, whose body travelled in our time for treatment, reminding us that the dead can still be moved by the living for reasons of respect. Science will walk beside belief. Closed places keep old air, fine dust, quiet moulds. Modern tools, CT, careful genetics, conservation, can answer questions without tearing cloth. Ancient texts will keep their intended tone, protective, practical, patient. If legend appears, we will set it gently beside the facts and let both be seen. This is not a hunt for fright. It is a lesson in attention. How rooms keep their shape, how names keep their power, how a harsh word can soften when we read it in context. If a door opens, we will enter softly. If it does not, we will let it rest. Either way, the night will remain kind, and the story will move forward without waking the dark. On Egypt's West Bank at Thebes, today Luxor, the Nile divides a living city from a landscape of sleep. The Valley of the Kings is a dry wadi cut into limestone, used mainly during the 18th-20th dynasties, c. 1539-1077 BCE. Tombs here are recorded by number: KV 35 Amenhotep II, KV 20 Hatshepsut, and KV 62 for Tutankhamun. By the early 20th century, more than 60 royal tombs were known. The valley looked complete, yet it was not. The valley's practicality is part of its calm. Limestone holds a clean edge. Desert air preserves pigment and wood. Turns in the corridors help protect chambers from theft. Across the ridge lay el-Medina, the planned village of royal tomb workers, active chiefly in the New Kingdom. Their days are written on ostraca, flakes of limestone inked with rations, absences, jokes, and orders. They measured corridors in cubits, mixed mineral pigments that still hold colour, and sealed doors with plaster and clay impressed by official rings. Much of what the modern world calls mystery, they called procedure. Belief gave the procedure its aim. A person had Ka and Ba and Ren, vital force, roaming soul and name, kept in balance by Mat. In the Hall of Judgment, the heart was weighed against the feather of Mat. Spell 125 taught the rightful speech. Funerary texts shifted over centuries, pyramid texts in stone for early kings, coffin texts widening access. Later, selections from the Book of the Dead written on papyrus as a chosen toolkit, not a single book. Protection lived in objects as much as in words. The heart scarab asked the heart not to testify against its owner. The diged pillar steadied the spine. The wedjat eye healed. The tiet knot of Isis promised care. Canopic jars guarded by the four sons of Horus, Imseti, liver, Hapi, lungs, Duamutef, stomach, Kebesenuef, intestines, were themselves protected by goddesses Isis, Nephthys, Neith, and Selket. The opening of the mouth ritual restored breath and speech. Small Ushabti figures answered, "Here I am," when labor was called in the fields of the blessed. Mummification practiced patience. The body dried in natron about 40 days, then was resined and wrapped for roughly another month, around 70 days in all. Linen rebuilt the human outline layer by layer. Coffins nested, often 2 or 3, inside a stone sarcophagus. Ceilings were painted with stars, so orientation could not be lost in the long night. Doorways carried images that taught the soul how to move forward. None of this was designed to frighten the living. It was a map for keeping a person whole. Tutankhamun belongs to a careful turn in this story. He reigned in the 14th century BCE, c. 1332-1323 BCE, after the religious experiment at Amarna. His tomb is small for a king, but coherent, a compact suite arranged to protect rather than to impress. The modern chapter begins with dates that still hold their clarity. On the 4th November 1922, Howard Carter's team uncovered a cut stair. On 26 November, he peered into the antechamber and said he saw wonderful things. On the 16th of February 1923, the burial chamber was opened. In the rooms stood 2 life-size guardian figures, black as night with gold at the eyes. At the core, 4 nested gilded shrines enclosed a quartzite sarcophagus, and within that, coffins down to the innermost that lay against the body. The method that followed set a new standard of calm. Harry Burton photographed on glass plates before anything moved. Alfred Lucas, a chemist, stabilized fragile wood, resin, and paint, so the first breath of modern air would not undo 3 millennia of stillness. Objects were numbered, drawn, and mapped, positions recorded. Only then were things lifted. Headlines outside preferred a faster word, curse, but the rooms themselves taught slower grammar, conservation before display, notes before conclusions. The valley also tells a story of rescue. In the troubled years after the New Kingdom, priests re-hid royal mummies to save them from thieves. At Deir el-Bahri, DB 320, found in 1881, and in KV 35, entered in 1898 by Victor Loret, kings and queens were gathered together, names brushed in quick ink on linen. Among them lay Rameses III and Rameses III. The practice was not desecration. It was loyalty under pressure, a second burial with fewer words and more urgency. When modern teams opened those caches, the same duty returned in a new form. Record first, disturb as little as possible, let the dead remain themselves under new light. The modern world sometimes had to travel to keep that promise. In 1976, to treat fungal damage and allow detailed study, Rameses II was flown to Paris, a journey handled with official documents and clinical restraint. Conservators treated the growths, recorded old injuries and ailments, and the king returned to Cairo in 1977. The episode is often retold because it makes a clear point. Care can cross borders without turning a person into a spectacle. Movement, when named honestly as conservation, keeps faith with Mart. One more thread steadies the ground beneath the famous cases. Order here was never maintained by magic alone. It was, and remains, lists, seals, schedules, and measured light. Abbot Papyrus inquiries in the 20th dynasty record tomb inspections with a clerk's exactness. Modern field logs echo that tone. The most reliable protection for the dead has always been attention from the living, controlled humidity, low illumination, limited exposure, and the humility to stop when the object asks for rest. Set together, geography, dates, tools, names, the background reads without strain. Thebes, Luxor is the place, New Kingdom, the main era, KV62, the small coherent suite where a boy king sleeps, DB320 and KV35, the shelters where kings were saved for later care. 1922-1923, the modern doorway into Tutankhamun's rooms. 1976-1977, the brief careful travel of Ramesses' toe. With these anchors in mind, the chapters to come can stay gentle without losing their shape. The word that ran ahead, curse, will be read beside the words the ancients preferred, order, name, and rest. Before anyone spoke of treasure, there was only a step cut in stone. On the western bank of the Nile at Thebes, today's Luxor, workmen clearing an old spoil heap just below the slope near Ramesses' sixth tomb, KV9, brushed away dust on 4th November 1922 and exposed the top edge of a stair. More steps followed, chiselled straight into the pale limestone, leading down to a plastered doorway whose surface still carried the necropolis seal. The jackal Anubis, set above the 9 captives, pressed into clay when the door was last made fast. For years, since 1917, Howard Carter had argued on the strength of small clues, displaced ceilings and objects bearing a boy king's name, that the valley, despite more than 60 recorded royal tombs, still hid one burial. The staircase answered his patience without raising its voice. Carter did not force the door. He ordered the stair recovered, set watchmen at the mouth, and wrote his cable across the sea to his patron, Lord Carnarvon. At last have made wonderful discovery in valley, a magnificent tomb with seals intact, recovered until your arrival. The days that followed were purposeful rather than loud. Measurements were taken, the fill was trimmed and tidied, impressions on the plaster were studied by lamplight, but left unbroken. People would later trade different versions of how the first step was noticed, but Carter's notebook keeps to what can be weighed and written: a stair, a sealed threshold, a promise kept by the desert. Even before anything was opened, much could be read. The doorway lay where others had passed often, tucked beneath the leavings of earlier digs, a reminder that absence on a plan is not absence in the ground. The practical genius of the valley explained the rest. The wadi's dryness keeps wood and paint, the limestone holds a clean edge, the corridors of royal tombs turn and dip to shelter the rooms that matter. If this entrance belonged to the young pharaoh whose name had haunted the surface finds, then inside would not be a trap for the living, but a machine for memory, a compact suite designed to protect a single life with order rather than spectacle. 2 dates waited ahead that the team could not yet see. 26th November 1922, when a small breach would give the first look into the antechamber, and the 16th of February 1923, when the burial chamber itself would open. For the moment, the story held to a gentler pace, patience answering patience, seal answering seal. A door is also a promise. The men on the stair chose to keep it. When at last a gap was made, the first thing to pass would not be a headline, but a small, steady light. This was only the beginning, and the valley, which had kept still for more than 3,000 years, was willing to keep still a little longer. This is the moment the tomb first reveals itself, and the lesson is simple. method before marvel. On the 26th November 1922, with Lord Carnarvon and Evelyn Herbert beside him, Howard Carter widened a small breach in the plastered doorway and raised a shaded lamp. The antechamber answered in a calm, crowded hush. Gilded couches with animal heads at rest, disassembled chariots leaned against a wall, boxes and shrines stacked with lids a finger's width askew, a golden throne, and fans whose ostrich plumes had faded to straw. Facing the sealed passage to the inner room, two life-size guardians, black as a moonless hour, eyes edged with gold, held their quiet watch. Among the objects a name appeared more than once: Tutankhamun. Carter's Wonderful Things was not a headline. It was the soft release of breath after years of looking. From that first look, the room became a plan. Harry Burton set up glass plate photographs so the chamber could speak without a finger moving anything. Arthur Callender measured and drew a floor plan. A string grid crossed the dust. Small numbered tags settled like calm punctuation. Alfred Lucas, the chemist, tested fragile gilding and resin, deciding where a touch of consolidant might prevent loss when still air met breath and light. Even simple choices kept the tomb side: shaded lamps to spare heat, a guard at the stair, short days to keep fatigue, the other thief outside. The chamber's apparent confusion resolved into intention, a kit for a young king's journey, arranged to work in the long night. The first glimpse did not close any grand question. It taught everyone how to walk. A tomb here is a guide before it is a story. If patience set the lamp low, patience would also turn the first page. Outside, rumour began to move. Inside, procedure held. Record before touch. Stabilize before lift. Respect before reveal. The guardians kept their posts. The tags trembled only when someone passed. The new century entered by degrees, and the room accepted it, on the condition that the pace remained gentle. On 16th February 1923, the sealed passage in KV 62 was opened, and the burial chamber received a gentler light. The room was small for a king, but exact in meaning, a ceiling of stars so direction could not be lost, walls with calm scenes of the young pharaoh before divine figures. At the centre, 4 gilded wooden shrines fitted so closely that air seemed woven between them. Within stood a red quartzite sarcophagus. Within that, nested coffins, layers of care closing the distance between name and body. In the next room, the treasury, a jackal shrine of Anubis watched over an alabaster canopic chest protected by 4 goddesses with open arms. What changed now was not the story, but the tone. Treasure gave way to conservation. Harry Burton photographed each stage before a hand moved. Alfred Lucas calmed resins and fragile gilding so old stillness would meet new air without harm. Positions were drawn and numbered, the work paced through seasons from 1923 into the early 1930s. The chamber taught its own rule: record before touch, stabilize before lift, respect before reveal. What waited here had been arranged to keep a life whole. The team chose to keep it that way, even as the world waited outside for a brighter word. On 5 April 1923, only 7 weeks after the burial chamber of KV 62 was opened, on 16th of February 1923, Lord Carnarvon died in Cairo from an infection that began as a small bite and worsened into fever and sepsis. He had come to Egypt to stand beside Howard Carter for the work he had financed since 1917. Now, telegrams left the city before the desert dust could settle. By morning, London had columns set. By afternoon, New York repeated them. wire agencies stitched Cairo to the world in a single day. The pattern was too neat for a restless century to ignore. A sealed royal tomb broken, a patron suddenly gone. A short word stepped forward to explain what patience had not yet had time to say: curse. Around Luxor, a smaller story swelled to fit the headline. A cobra slipping into Carter's house and killing his canary, the snake of Wadjet against the bird of luck, retold as if the valley itself had sent a sign. In Cairo, some said the lights flickered the moment Carnarvon died. In Europe, papers without access to Carter's careful notes, bound by an exclusive that favoured the Times, filled their columns with second-hand detail, the way wind fills sails. A gentle truth trailed behind the noise. The team's method had remained slow and precise. Harry Burton's glass plates before any touch, Alfred Lucas's chemistry to steady resin and gilding, Arthur Callender's measured plans. But method does not travel as quickly as a sudden sorrow. The earlier dates now looked like steps toward this moment. On 4th November 1922, a cut step appeared below the slope near Ramesses II's tomb, KV9. On 26th November, a shaded lamp found gilded couches, disassembled chariots, and two black guardian figures guarding a sealed passage. On the 16th of February, the inner door yielded to a starry ceiling and 4 nested gilded shrines around a red quartzite sarcophagus. Each event had been met with the same restraint: record before touch, stabilize before lift. Yet grief taught a different rhythm, and the public heard it first. Even the small facts were turned to fit the new story. The infection that followed a trivial wound became fate. The cobra became omen rather than animal. A city's flicker became a sign rather than a circuit. Words that the walls of KV62 do not carry, "Death shall come on swift wings," were quoted as if the paint itself had spoken them. It is not that fear lied, it simply arrived too quickly, and with a voice the valley does not use. In the rooms beneath the hillside, order still held. Guardians kept their posts, star ceilings kept direction, lists and numbers kept a young king's things from becoming only marvels. Outside, the rumour learned to run. What remains, even in the rush, is the shape of a gentler account. A patron's health failed in a hot season. Reporters worked at speed. The world preferred a single cause where life rarely gives one. Meanwhile, the desert kept its older sentence: move slowly, keep your balance, remember that a door is a promise. The news that day would finish faster than the work. The work, being careful, would outlast the news. The sentence most often quoted, "Death shall come on swift wings to him who disturbs the king," is not written on the walls of KV62. Tutankhamun's burial chamber, completed around 1323 BCE on the West Bank at Thebes, Luxor, speaks in a different tone. Its star-painted ceiling keeps orientation in the long night. Its painted scenes show the young king before protective deities, a ritual world arranged for safe passage rather than threat. At the sealed doorway, 2 life-size guardians stand not as executioners but as attendants, dark as a moonless hour with gold at the eyes, steadying the air between rooms. Within, 4 nested gilded shrines surround a red quartzite sarcophagus. Beyond, in the treasury, a jackal shrine of Anubis watches over an alabaster canopic chest, itself protected by 4 goddesses with open arms: Isis, Nephthys, Neith, Selket. The grammar is protection, the architecture is care. Elsewhere in Egypt, sharper lines do appear at thresholds and false doors, requests that intruders be judged or that offerings be withheld from those who harm the arrangement. Those texts belong to Ma'at, the balance the living were meant to keep. Respect the seal, preserve the name, leave the order intact. Read in that older register, warning is not a curse that hunts, it is a rule that holds. KV 62 follows that register, with images more than sentences. A ceiling of stars to prevent disorientation, shrines within shrines to slow any hand, attendants at the door to remind a passer that this is not a corridor, but a promise. Nothing in the chamber instructs us to fear the dead. Everything instructs us to keep the shape of a person so the soul can find its way home. It helps to place the details where they belong. The valley is dry limestone cut into rooms that turn and dip. The tomb's compact plan, antechamber, annex, burial chamber, treasury, is a path, not a puzzle. The canopic ensemble names the organs and their guardians with the tidiness of a list. The shrines fit so closely that the air between them seems woven, a physical way of slowing the world while the dead are being kept whole. Even the painted scenes choose calm, receptions, offerings, embraces, gestures that continue a life rather than close it. If later centuries wanted a single sentence that snaps shut, the chamber offers instead a set of arrangements that open gently and only as needed. So the walls do say something, just not what rumour prefers. They say, proceed with care, match patience with patience, let the plan do its work. If we listen in that key, the imagined threat softens into instruction. The valley's language has always been practical, stars for direction, names for presence, guardians for attention. Read that way, KV 62 does not frighten the living. It teaches them how to behave in a room designed for sleep. The comfort is not sentimental, it is structural. And once you feel it, the bright word that ran ahead, curse, falls a step behind the older words the ancients trusted more: order, name, rest. Sealed rooms keep more than history. When the burial chamber of KV 62 opened on 16th February 1923, the first visitors met air that had slept for centuries, fine dust and quiet spores waking in the light. Resins soften when stillness breaks, fragile gilding and paints can shed, long hours in Upper Egypt strain even careful bodies. These are plain conditions, not omens. Follow the lives instead of the headlines, and the pattern softens. Howard Carter worked on until 1939, photographer Harry Burton to 1940, chemist Alfred Lucas to 1945. Others fell ill and recovered, as people do who labour in heat, solvents and close air. The valley's older rule, record before touch, stabilise before lift, is also a kind of medicine. The rumour moved faster because the age loved a sharp sentence. In April 1923, with Lord Carnarvon dead in Cairo from infection, an exclusive with the Times left other papers to fill their columns second-hand. A cobra and a canary became a sign. A city's flicker became an omen. Minds reach for pattern. Confirmation and availability are quiet biases, and a sealed door makes a powerful picture. But the chamber's language remains practical. Star sealing for direction, shrines to slow the hand, guardians to remind us that this is a promise, not a threat. Read beside that grammar, the curse looks less like anger from the dead and more like the price of hurry meeting very old air. In 1881, high in the cliffs at Deir el-Bahri on the west bank of Thebes, Luxor, officials opened a hidden collective burial now called DB 320. It was a refuge made centuries after the New Kingdom, where priests re-hid royal mummies to save them from thieves. Among the orderly coffins lay an unsettling figure later catalogued as Unknown Man E. His jaw had fallen open, his wrappings were uneven, and reports note a goatskin placed with the body, an animal covering the Egyptians often viewed as ritually impure. In 1898, a second cache in KV35, Amenhotep II, confirmed how common these rescues were. Kings and kin gathered quietly, names brushed in quick ink on linen. The troubled body, though, seemed to carry a different story, one of haste, interruption, and perhaps disgrace. Modern examinations would add layers rather than final answers. CT imaging tracing bone without unwrapping linen, genetic tests hinting at close kinship with a royal line. Yet even here the valley keeps its tone. An open mouth can follow drying, a slack jaw is not a scream. What we hold with certainty is gentler, a person set apart in a room made for safety, asking to be described with care. Around 1155 BCE, court records known today as the Judicial Papyrus of Turin describe a plot inside the royal household of Rameses III. A secondary queen, often rendered Tie, gathered allies to remove the king and place her favoured son on the throne. The papyrus preserves the trial's clipped rhythm, defendants named, confessions recorded, sentences issued. Among those judged was a prince called Pentawere, condemned not to a public execution but to take his own life, a punishment the text frames as a grim permission rather than a spectacle. The documents are bureaucratic rather than lurid. They read like the minutes of a storm held indoors. Because the conspiracy touched the succession, later readers have set the papyrus beside the troubled body nicknamed Unknown Man E. The timing aligns with the caches where royals were reburied. The goatskin noted with the body suggests stigma. The hurried wrappings hint at a ritual cut short. In modern scholarship, the name Pentawere is often suggested for the man, but only suggested. The papyrus does not identify a mummy, and the mummy does not carry a label. Between the lines lies the valley's usual patience. A royal plot ended in judgment. A royal body was set apart. The two may belong to one life, but they do not demand it. The story stays gentle when we let both pieces breathe, a prince recorded by ink and a person recorded by linen, each asking to be read with care. Modern tools entered the royal rooms without raising their voices. In the early 2010s, CT scanning of Rameses III showed what the ink of the trial had never said outright: a deep cut at the throat, clean and fatal, hidden under necklaces and wrappings that embalmers had arranged to keep the royal outline whole. The images read like a polite correction to centuries of guesswork, a narrow wound instead of rumour, a single moment instead of a cloud of omens. In the same studies, the troubled figure called Unknown Man E stood close to that king in a genetic sense. Tests suggested a first-degree paternal link, a kinship that makes son plausible without forcing the door of certainty. Cause of death for the open-mouthed man remains less firm. Some signs look friendly to strangulation, others allow for poison or the simple mechanics of desiccation leaving the jaw slack. The scans are clear. The verdict, if we are honest, is not. What science gives most reliably in these rooms is shape. Bone keeps memory where ink falls silent. Linen holds the history of hands, tight where haste pressed, neat where ritual had time. CT can follow a blade's path without tearing cloth. DNA can whisper of family where labels were never written. Both can respect the stillness the tombs were built to keep. The lesson is less about triumph than about tone. Every new detail sits inside a larger intention that is older than our devices, to preserve a person so that presence can continue. When the scans revealed Rameses III's wound, embalmers' choices, padding, amulets, careful wrapping, appeared not as concealment but as care, a way to let a king remain a king, even when history would someday lift a lid and look. That is why the question of names asks for a softer voice. Pentewa is a good hypothesis for unknown man E. The time fits, the papyrus trial fits, the stigma of a goatskin makes cultural sense. But a name, once spoken, can harden around a person like plaster. The cache where he lay, DB 320 and the second shelter in KV 35, was meant to keep the royal dead safe, not to make them props in a clean story. We honor that intention when we let a probable prince remain unknown man E until the evidence is kind enough to do the naming for us. In a valley that prefers promises to pronouncements, restraint is not a lack, it is a courtesy. So the tools stay and the room stays calm. We know more now that Rameses III died by a blade, that the unsettled body was likely his close kin, that the conspiracy written in clipped lines of court prose ended in a sharp instant for the king and a troubled afterlife for someone near him. We also know what we do not know, and we are willing to let that space remain shade. The dead are better served by care than by cleverness. If science must speak here, it should speak as the embalmers did, quietly, precisely, and with the intention to keep a person whole. Long after the great funerals ended, other hands returned to the West Bank with a quieter task. In the unsettled years after the New Kingdom, during the 21st dynasty, c. 1069–945 BCE, priests of Amun quietly removed royal mummies from plundered tombs and hid them together for safety. One refuge lay high in the cliffs at Deir el-Bahri, a shaft and corridor now called DB 320, TT 320. Another was KV 35, the tomb of Amenhotep II. The intention was practical and loyal at once, to preserve kings, queens, and kin when the old seals no longer held. The world met these shelters in the 19th century. DB 320 was officially opened in 1881 under Gaston Maspero after local reports drew officials to the cliff. Inside, coffins and bodies lay in ranks, names brushed in quick ink on linen where gold and long epitaphs were no longer possible. Many of the greatest names of the New Kingdom had been gathered there, Ramesside rulers among them, their wrappings repaired where mice and thieves had cut, their identities rescued in haste and care. In 1898, Victor Loret entered KV 35 and found Amenhotep II still within his stone sarcophagus, with side chambers adapted as a second cache, royal men and women replaced in secrecy, labels improvised, dignity preserved as best as circumstances allowed. The site in both places felt less like a treasure room than like a family sheltering during a long storm. These caches explain why so many royal bodies reached modern study at all. After their 19th century discoveries, the mummies were transferred to Cairo for examination and conservation. Scholars like G.E. Smith in the early 1900s described injuries, pathologies, and features that the living face on a statue cannot show. The tone of the notes is telling: measurements first, identifications cautiously, repairs where needed. Even the labels, inked names on linen ties, read like promises kept under pressure. The priest's choices had already set the pace. Modern work, at its best, learned to match it. Standing in these rooms, you can see why the word curse does not belong here. DB320 and KV35 were rescue rooms, not stages. The quick handwriting, the close-set coffins, the rewrapping that mends more than it hides, all of it says loyalty in lean times. When we later meet Rameses, his reign long, his name bright, we meet him because others moved him first, not to display him, but to keep him whole. The line that runs from a priest's brush to a conservator's logbook is unbroken in its intention. Preserve the person, let the order hold, do what is needed and no more. If you listen a moment longer, the lesson quiets the brighter word that travelled elsewhere. Protection here was never a threat, it was a practice. The caches teach that care can be decisive without being loud, that moving the dead can be an act of fidelity, and that the gentlest writing in the room, the hurried ink on linen, is often the most important line of all. In 1976, the body of Rameses II left Egypt for the first time in 3 millennia, not to be shown, but to be treated. Paperwork was issued so the king could travel. Formal documents often retold as a passport, listing his occupation, Riley, as king, deceased. At Le Bourget, the arrival was handled with courtesies due a head of state. Then the journey turned quiet, up the steps of the Musée de l'Homme, where curators and microbiologists began to read what time had done. The aim was plain. Fungal infestation had to be stopped, linen and skin stabilized, the record made clear before the patient, because the word felt right, returned home. Under steady lights, the work proceeded with a bedside calm. X-rays documented bone and old injuries, samples were taken sparingly, conservation teams strengthened weak areas of the wrappings and reduced the growth that threatened them. Diagnoses long guessed at were written down with dates and measures: arthritis in the spine and hips, dental wear, the small commas of life's ordinary damage. The treatment did not stage a king, it kept a person whole. In 1977, Ramesses II flew back to Cairo, the journey described in reports with the same unhurried tone. Paperwork closed, condition improved, the long rest resumed. The episode is retold because it draws a useful line. Movement can be fidelity when it is named as conservation, with goals, limits, and a timetable that ends in return. It becomes performance only when the body is asked to carry a story louder than its care. Paris showed how to keep the volume low, explain the work, publish the findings, avoid the bright temptation to turn treatment into a tour. The lesson folds neatly into the Valley's older grammar: order kept by attention, respect measured in small decisions. A royal cache in a cliff and a clinic in another city are points on the same map. Both say, do what is needed and no more. Museums learned to speak softly around the dead. Cases were sealed so air would stay even. Light was kept low, often no brighter than a quiet room, so dyes and resins would not fade. Humidity was held steady so linen would not crack or bloom with mold. Objects that had slept in darkness were shown for a while and then rested, the way a voice rests between sentences. Labels changed too. Instead of promises of spectacle, they offered context: why the light is dim, why a box cannot be opened today, why a number is kinder than a name when certainty is thin. Some places chose facsimiles for fragile rooms, letting the original walls keep their color, while visitors learned the pattern without taking anything from it. The aim was not to hide, it was to let presence continue. Policies followed the tone. Human remains were given the language of persons rather than props. Photographs were framed as records, not trophies. Loans were made for treatment, not for tours, with a plan to return and a report to show what had been done. The difference can be felt in small choices: cloth that supports rather than grips, mounts that hold without piercing, a schedule that honours rest. In that arrangement, the old word curse finds no work to do. Attention is protection enough. A room that asks for quiet does not need a threat. It needs patience and the promise that the living will keep their hands light. In London, a painted face learned to speak with a voice it never asked for. The object is not a mummy at all, but a mummy-board cartonnage made of linen and plaster, fashioned at Thebes in the Third Intermediate Period, when the 21st and 22nd dynasties kept memory with careful economy. The British Museum Catalogue calls it EA 2542. Its purpose was simple: to lie above a coffin and help a name remain. Over time, that purpose was folded into a louder story. Accidents near the museum were gathered like loose beads, private misfortunes were threaded onto the same string, and the board was blamed for being where wood and paint have always been, quietly present. The legend reached even farther when people said it had sailed on a great liner and helped to pull her down. The liner was the RMS Titanic, lost in the North Atlantic on 15th April 1912. The board, however, did not sail. Museum paperwork, unromantic and exact, shows it moving only between storerooms and galleries, photographed, conserved, described, the way any funerary panel is. Rumour travels faster than a catalogue can turn its pages. If you stand in front of the panel long enough, the painted gaze stops being ominous and becomes attentive. The pigments that survived in dry Egyptian air are the same that now prefer low light. The linen that once held a priestly title prefers steady humidity and rest. Symbols that the legend calls menacing read differently in their own grammar. A wedjat eye for healing, a knot of Isis for care, a border that keeps the figure in its proper frame. The board's voice is not a threat, but a set of instructions for continuity. How to present a person to gods and judges with courtesy. How to keep a presence from thinning in the long night. Stories about curses confuse protection with punishment. The object is clear about which it offers. Even the Titanic thread unties without force. The date of the sinking is known, the list of her cargo is known, the museum's registers are known. None of these lines meet. What does meet is a different set of facts. The piece was acquired in the late 19th century. It remained in the museum's care. It became the subject of photographs and conservation reports rather than sea logs. The board did travel in another way through newspapers and parlours, because a painted face invites a modern audience to imagine speech. Into that space the age poured an appetite for omen. The appetite says more about us than about the dead. If a curse was ever needed here, the museum would not be the place to find it. The glass around the object is a promise of even air. The labels are promises of context. The light is a promise that colours will not be hurried into fading. In that gentle arrangement, the board returns to the work it was made to do: guide a stranger through judgment, keep a name from loosening, make a small but steady bridge between breath and what follows breath. The legend, once acknowledged, can sit beside the facts without troubling them. The face still looks back, but it looks back in welcome rather than warning, and the room asks us to answer in kind, with patience, with lowered voice, with the understanding that care is the opposite of fear. Across the river from the royal wadi, the village of Deir el-Medina kept the necropolis running with a steadiness that feels like sleep. From the 18th to 20th dynasties, c. 1550–1070 BCE, craftsmen walked the same path each dawn to cut and paint royal tombs, and each evening they returned to houses where ink dried on ostraca, limestone flakes that recorded rations issued, absences excused, tools checked, and warnings noted. When robberies troubled the West Bank late in the New Kingdom, the bureaucracy answered in its calm voice. The Abbot Papyrus, dated to year 16 of Ramesses IX, c. 1110 BCE, sets out formal tomb inspections, seals examined and described, corridors measured in cubits, doorways probed, damage sketched in words, suspects questioned by the necropolis scribe and local officials. Names of tomb owners, locations among the hills, the condition of plaster and blocking. Each detail sits where it belongs, as if the paper itself were a small, portable doorway kept in order. Read beside such pages, the valley's protection is not a threat. It is procedure, lists and witnesses, seals renewed, records filed, so that memory stays whole. The workers' notes make a quieter promise than any legend. If a door is a promise, someone will count the threads of its seal and write the number down. In that simple habit, the dead are kept safe by the living, and a rumor has no work to do. Egyptian tombs speak most clearly when they whisper instructions. In the papyri we call the Book of the Dead, no single book exists. Families chose spells like tools. Spell 125 prepares the heart for its weighing before Osiris, teaching a truthful tongue in the negative confession. Spell 30b asks the heart scarab to keep silence at the crucial moment, so the organ of memory will not testify against its owner. Around the body, amulets do the quiet work of order. The Dajjed pillar, a sign of Osiris, promises stability to the spine. The Wedjat, eye of Horus, promises healing and protection. The Tayet knot of Isis, often read, promises care as tender as blood. These are not threats aimed at the living, but courtesies extended to the dead, a way of keeping a person complete. Protection is also a geometry. In Tutankhamun's world, the canopic chest holds 4 preserved organs, entrusted to the 4 sons of Horus. Imseti guards the liver, Hapi the lungs, Duamutef the stomach, Kebesenuef the intestines. Each son stands under the open arms of a goddess, Isis, Nephthys, Nith, Selket, so duty is reinforced by care. Nearby, rows of small Ushabti promise labor in the fields of the blessed, answering on the owner's behalf, "Here I am." Overhead, a star-painted ceiling prevents disorientation in the long night, and on walls the chosen passages guide the bar back to the body as reliably as a landmark on a shoreline. Read together, text and object turn the chamber into a map that the soul can follow without fear. In this grammar, a curse is simply the wrong word. The tomb's language prefers balance, instructions instead of threats, remedies instead of omens, patience instead of haste. When we keep that pace, reading a spell before lifting a lid, letting an amulet keep its post, the room answers with the calm it was built to hold, and the traveller it protects can continue without being disturbed. The curse, most people picture, was rehearsed not in a tomb, but on a screen. In 1932, in Hollywood, Universal released The Mummy with Boris Karloff, teaching audiences a simple rule: open a forbidden door, and the past wakes angry. A generation later, in 1959, Hammer Films in London retold the tale with richer shadows and a slower dread, so the lesson could be learned again. By 1999, Anew the Mummy brightened the palate and quickened the pace, turning fear into adventure while keeping the hinge of the plot the same: a breached tomb, a price to pay. These stories were never archaeology. They were parables that fit neatly into an evening, a closed space, a broken seal, a consequence. Still they shaped the ear of the world. Viewers learned to hear menace where ancient rooms had written care, to expect retribution where the walls had prepared guidance. Cinema compressed what the valley lets unfold, myth in 2 hours instead of method over seasons, so that a single word could stand where a quieter grammar belongs. In 1972, the British Museum opened Treasures of Tutankhamun, and London queued in long, patient lines that curled past the railings. Visitors came for gold and for a face that seemed to look back across 3 millennia. Inside, they met a different lesson. Light was kept low so pigments would not fade. Cases were sealed to hold steady temperature and humidity. Organic pieces were shown for a time and then rested. Labels began to speak a new language: why brightness is limited, why a lid stays closed today, how a surface is consolidated before it is moved. Wonder did not leave the room. It learned to share the room with care. From 1976 to 1979, the exhibition toured the United States, and the same pattern repeated at a larger scale: lines outside, soft light inside, and a voice that placed conservation ahead of spectacle. Behind the scenes, photographers and conservators documented each object before and after travel. Microclimates were measured the way a scribe once counted seals. People arrived for a legend and left remembering procedure: record before touch, stabilize before lift, respect before reveal. The old word curse did not vanish, but it lost its edge. A calmer grammar took its place, one that lets the night and the objects remain kind. After the crowds of the 1970s, the story did not stop. It simply learned to lower its voice. Documentaries and museum audio guides began to dwell on pigments and salts, on airflow and light, until the word conservation sounded as familiar as treasure. Schoolbooks folded in the same shift, teaching that the Valley of the Kings is not a place of punishments, but a place of mart, order kept by attention. The exhibitions that followed carried this tone forward. London's show in 1972 had set the pattern, and the long 1976-1979 tour across the United States confirmed that wonder can share a room with restraint. People still came for gold. They left remembering why cases are sealed and why organic objects are shown for a season and then allowed to rest. In the new century, a different solution closed the loop more gently. High-resolution recording, color, relief, and even the grain of plaster made it possible to build a full-scale facsimile of Tutankhamun's burial chamber, opened near the Carter House outside Luxor in 2014. Visitors could read the room's painted grammar at true scale, while the original kept its breath in controlled air. The copy did not pretend to be an equal. It served as a buffer, the way a shade serves a window. Meanwhile, museums published their climate targets in plain words, and guides explained why a lid stays closed today, why a light is dimmer than the hall outside, why a name is sometimes a number until certainty is kind enough to speak. The legend that once hurried ahead, curse, found less to do because the facts had learned to walk at a pace that people could follow without losing their calm. Popular media adjusted in small, faithful ways. Films kept their forbidden doors, but documentaries began to pair them with the tools that keep rooms whole. data loggers that trace humidity the way a scribe once traced a seal, low-energy lighting that spares dyes, bounce that hold without biting. Virtual tours and high-resolution stills let a visitor linger on a painted star or a figure's open hand without adding heat to the wall. The loop that once amplified fear now returns attention to the place it belongs, on method, on patience, on the ordinary decisions that let a chamber keep its weather. In the end, the story that began as a thrill learns to land as a lesson. Not that the dead strike back, but that the living can learn to be quiet around other people's sleep. The first thing that leaves a sealed room is its stillness. When the burial chamber of KV-62 opened in February 1923, the new air carried fine dust and sleeping spores into the lamplight. Ancient resins, stable in darkness, soften when warmth and oxygen return. Gilding and pigments can loosen as salts migrate to the surface. Even a gentle change in relative humidity can make linen tighten and crack, or coax a faint white bloom along a painted blue. Conservators learn to read these signs the way a scribe once read a seal. Modern caution is unromantic and precise. Light is counted in lux hours, so colors don't hurry toward fading. Temperature and humidity are held to narrow bands, so wood and plaster don't swell and shrink. Working shifts are short, so fatigue, the quietest thief, stays outside the door. Instruments keep diaries more faithful than memory. Data loggers watching the air second by second, small filters catching dust before it settles on a god's hand. The aim is simple: help the room keep its own weather. Some risks will always be hard to measure. A door opened a finger's width can change a draft in the far corner. A visitor's breath can tip a microclimate you cannot see. The stone remembers old salts from ancient floods, and they wake slowly under modern lamps. We do not solve these things once, we attend to them. The lesson the valley offers is not dramatic. Slow work saves detail. The mask that looks like moonlight, the ink that still trembles at the end of a stroke. These survive when we let the room set the pace. A tomb is a promise as much as a room, and promises make their own rules. Modern museums learn to place human remains inside a language that sounds like courtesy. Low light, so colors do not hurry toward fading, steady air, so linen does not sigh and crack, and periods of rest long enough that a face seen this month can sleep again for the next. Numbers are used when certainty is thin. An inventory mark can be kinder than a name that guesses. When a label does speak a name, it does so because the evidence is calm and sufficient, not because the gallery needs a sentence to end the story. Codes and policies translate that courtesy into practice. A typical target keeps organic materials at about 50 lux of light. Temperature and humidity are held within narrow bands so that wood and plaster do not swell and shrink. Photography is limited or softened. Display is rotation, not possession. Objects are shown for a season and then return to darkness because darkness is a medicine. Catalogues record every movement. Treatments are written down with dates and materials, so the next hand knows what the last hand did. What reads as restraint on a wall label is care at work behind a door. People belong to the rule as much as objects do. Human remains are described as persons, not props. Cameras are asked to behave like note-takers rather than trophies. Loans are made for treatment or research with timetables that end in return. When identity is uncertain, museums keep the softer form, unknown man E, the mummy of a young woman, until evidence is kind enough to do the naming for us. When identity is known, institutions ask if the voice of that name should be heard in public at all, or if a number and a quiet case tell the truth more gently. Between those choices, dignity is not an idea but a sequence of small decisions, a mount that holds without biting, a cloth that supports without leaving a line, a case that lets breath even out. There are public moments when the dead move again. In Cairo, royal mummies have been transferred with ceremony from older cases to newer homes, the way a family might change a loved one's room and speak softly while they do it. In another century, a king travelled abroad for treatment and returned when the work was done. These passages test the line between conservation and display, and they are passed well when the purpose is plain. Care, not spectacle. Clarity, not noise. The measure of success is quiet, the sense that what was promised by the tomb has not been broken by the living. Consultation belongs here too. Curators and conservators speak with ministries and committees, with scholars of belief and of material, so that a person in a case does not become only a lesson or a thrill. Sometimes the kindest answer is absence, a gallery left dim, a lid left closed, a photograph standing in for a body that will not be shown this year. Silence can be a form of respect. The ancients understood that when they painted stars overhead and asked the living to keep their balance. We answer best when we adopt the same pace, slow enough that the promise of the door remains intact, and the sleeper does not notice us passing by. Not every door in the valley is meant to open today. Archaeology, at its gentlest, includes the choice to leave some ground uncut so that future tools can read what ours would miss. The Valley of the Kings already holds over 60 recorded tombs, and the map still learns new edges, a shaft under spoil, a side passage masked by a slump of debris, a line of plaster that rings differently under a fingertip. Modern surveys move first with thermography, ground-penetrating radar, and quiet probes. Spades follow only when the picture is clear. In the decade after the Tutankhamun centenary, a series of scans around KV-62, first hopeful, then re-examined, taught a useful patience. Enticing signals can fade under stricter methods, and not proven is an answer the desert accepts. Silence here is often deliberate. Some decorated chambers stay closed for seasons, so salt blooms can subside and pigments can rest. Others rotate access so that a wall sees more darkness than light. A tomb like KV-17, Seti Ahang, for instance, has spent long intervals under limited visitation because its long corridors and fragile paint need more night than day. Curators of place, the ministry's teams, local conservators, treat the wadi as a living archive, with opening hours set by the health of stone and plaster, not by the calendar of visitors. When a replica stands in for an original, as the full-scale facsimile of Tutankhamun's burial chamber opened near the Carter House in 2014, it is not a trick. It is shade for a window. Questions remain by design. Beneath the neat catalogue numbers, there are unnamed burials beyond the royal wadi, workmen's graves and private tombs that speak in quieter registers. Their voices ask to be heard slowly. Even inside famous rooms, gaps are part of the plan. A missing inlay here, a broken line of text there, a resin that hides a join we will not force apart to satisfy a sentence. The ancients wrote mystery into their architecture, a star ceiling to make night hospitable, nested shrines that slow the hand, and we echo them when we choose to let a wall keep its secret until the right hour. The restraint is factual, not romantic. Microclimates shift when a door opens a finger's width. A group of warm bodies is weather. A draught can move salts that slept inside stone for centuries. Because of this, no and not yet are as essential to preservation as any consolidant. We learn to be content with indirect sight, a radar trace that implies a void, a core sample that reads the stone without disfiguring it, a model that allows us to understand a corridor's angle without stepping on it. Where the 19th century prized the hurry of firsts, the 21st has learned to prize what is left undisturbed. So the desert keeps things by our choice and for our sake. A blank on the plan can be a promise kept for another generation. An unanswered question can be a gift of time. In a landscape that was always about balance, the most faithful act may be to let a little night remain. The story does not become smaller when a door stays closed, it becomes steadier, and the sleeper within the wall is left with what the room was built to give: order, name, and rest. The inner rooms did not open like a chest, they unfolded like a thought. On the 16th of February 1923, when the sealed passage in KV 62 finally gave way, the light that entered was shaded and small, the kind of light that listens before it looks. The burial chamber was modest in size but exact in meaning, a night sky ceiling so a traveller would never lose direction, painted scenes where a young king meets protective gods, and at the centre 4 gilded shrines fitted so closely that the air between them felt woven. Work began at the outer skin and moved inward, one careful rhythm at a time. Measure, photograph, steady, pause. Nothing rushed. Even joy was quiet. Nested within the shrines stood a red quartzite sarcophagus, and within that coffins arranged one inside another until the last lay against the body. Resin had sealed the final layer with a dark, deliberate bond. Separation would be persuasion, not force. Heat was tempered, solvents placed drop by drop, gold leaf coaxed to hold where the centuries had taught it to stay. What modern eyes remember most, the mask, does not announce itself as a trophy when it is first seen at arm's length. It waits like a face prepared for recognition, lapis and glass where night asks for blue, gold worked to a softness that seems almost like skin, inlays that read less as decoration than as instructions for presence. The point of the object is not to dazzle, it is to anchor a person in a place where breath is memory. Around the work, a second story sets its pace. Harry Burton stands behind the ground glass of a camera that makes portraits, not snapshots. Alfred Lucas watches the chemistry of old resins and fragile paints, deciding where a touch will keep a surface calm when still air meets breath and light. In notebooks, positions are drawn before hands move anything. Numbers replace adjectives. The object world is allowed to remain itself. Outside, people ask for treasure. Inside, the room offers a method. The valley's grammar, record before touch, stabilize before lift, becomes the only way to cross from wonder to understanding without loss. Far from that star-painted ceiling, another chamber begins to speak in a different register. In the early years of the new century, the wrapped body of Ramesses III, long at rest and long debated, enters the tunnel of a CT scanner. The papyri of his reign, especially the judicial papyrus of Turin, describe a plot inside the royal house and a trial that followed, but the ink stops short of stating how the king's life ended. The images do not. They show a deep cut at the throat, sharp and fatal, concealed in antiquity by the embalmers with padding and amulets so that a king's outline would remain whole. The revelation is not noisy. It is a thin, clear line that closes a long uncertainty without disturbing the care that followed it. Beside this result, the unsettled figure from a royal cache, the man modern catalogues call Unknown Man E, gains a clearer place in the family without being forced into a name. Genetic work suggests a first-degree paternal link to Rameses III, and the posture and wrappings whisper of haste and trouble. The hypothesis that he was the Prince Pentawere, condemned to take his own life after the conspiracy, becomes plausible. The goatskin reported with the body reads as stigma in the culture that placed him. Yet even here the room asks for restraint. A kinship is not a label. A strong likelihood is not a verdict. Science speaks most honorably in these spaces when it says what it knows and lets the rest remain shade. Set the two scenes side by side, the golden face planned for recognition and the narrow wound that history had not seen clearly. And a different meaning of curse dissolves in the light. No inscription in Tutankhamun's chamber commands punishment. The architecture is a system of care, shrines that slow the hand, guardians who attend, a ceiling that teaches direction. No omen is needed to explain the king in the CT. The papyri and the images agree on a single human ending. Between them runs the same quiet intention that the desert has kept for 3,000 years. Keep the shape, keep the name, let order carry a person forward. Where rumor once supplied a single bright word, method supplies many small patient ones, and the story grows truer for their number. The climax, then, is not thunder. It is recognition. In one room, a face appears not to astonish strangers but to make a person present. In another, a wound appears not to frighten the living but to give history its line. Both moments ask for the same posture from us. Look closely, speak softly, and allow the past to keep its balance while we learn how it was made. The ancients wrote their promises in stars and resin. The moderns keep them in photographs and reports. When the work is honest, the exchange feels seamless. What once was called a curse becomes a lesson in attention. How to open a door without breaking the room, how to answer a question without taking more than we are due. When the lamp in KV62 is shaded again, the air remembers to be still. Dust settles, the guardians return to being simply present by the doorway. When the scanner's hum ends, the images are stored, and the room returns to its usual quiet. The past has given what it can without losing itself. The present has taken what it needs without mistaking that gift for license. This is the turning we carry into the night. Fear is easy and quick. Care is slower and keeps more. In a valley built for art, balance, that is the only victory that matters. What follows a famous door is not thunder but a change of habits. After the work at KV62, archaeology learned to count before it spoke. Photographs first, drawings second, hands last. Field logs became more than memory, they became the spine of a site, with page numbers that could carry a room from one season to the next without losing a detail. Conservation stepped out from the margins and took a seat at the center of the table. Solvents tested on scraps, not statues. Consolidants tried in patches no wider than a thumbnail, and the ordinary courage to stop when an object asked to rest. A tomb, once treated as a box of marvels, settled into its truer role, a climate to be kept. Museums changed their weather too. Light was lowered and counted in lux hours. Relative humidity learned to walk a narrow path so linen would not tighten and crack. Temperature drifted less than conversation. Organic materials, feather, wood, cartonnage, were displayed as if they were voices, not trophies. For a while, then back to darkness, because darkness is the medicine that keeps colour from forgetting itself. Mounts began to hold without biting. Glass began to shelter rather than shine. Labels replaced performance with context. Why a lid stays closed today, why a photograph stands in for a body, why a number can be kinder than a name when certainty is thin. Visitors left with a quiet vocabulary, stability, rest, rotation, that sounds unromantic until you hear how well it keeps a room whole. The public story learned a new tone. In 1972, London queued for treasures of Tutankhamun. In 1976, 1979, the United States did the same, and many came away remembering not only gold, but the reason the light was soft. High-resolution recording in the new century extended that lesson. Colours mapped, relief scanned, minute cracks traced like rivers on a map. In 2014, a full-scale facsimile of Tutankhamun's burial chamber opened near the Carter House, offering the painted grammar of the room at true scale while the original kept its breath in controlled air. A copy did not compete. It acted like shade for a window. The old appetite for a curse softened because the facts had learned to travel at a pace people could follow without losing their calm. Science stayed, but it learned to whisper. CT read bone through linen. Targeted DNA work asked small questions about kinship rather than flamboyant ones about destiny. Reports spoke in the gentler tense of evidence, consistent with, compatible with, likely, and sometimes the most faithful answer of all, not proven. When a deep cut appeared at the throat of Rameses III on a scan, the announcement was a line, not a trumpet. When an open-mouthed mummy stood closer by blood to that king than strangers do, the result was given with honesty and restraint. The aim was never to surprise the dead, it was to keep the living from mistaking discovery for permission. Ethics moved forward alongside method. Institutions began to treat human remains as people in public rooms, cases at eye level but not in reach, photographs framed as records, not prizes, loans made for treatment with timetables that end in return. Inventories tracked not only what an object is, but how long it has stood under light, when it last rested, what it prefers to be near. Some galleries chose absence, the softest answer, to questions they could otherwise have answered loudly. Silence became a tool that works, a closed lid became a kind of sentence that says more about respect than any paragraph could. The long tail reached the valley itself. Certain tombs rotated access or closed in seasons so that salt blooms could subside and paint could hold. Footfall was counted the way scribes once counted seals. Pathways were set not only for visitors, but for air. The site became a living archive with opening hours set by the health of stone and plaster, not by appetite. Even the work of telling the story learned to keep to the room's pace. Guides with shaded torches and the old names pronounced slowly. Audio that leaves space between sentences the way a conservator leaves space between touches. Outside the desert, a broader lesson took root. Closed places everywhere, from a wooden shrine in a damp church to a painted ceiling in a town hall, benefit from the same slow arithmetic. Measure first, admit light on purpose, let rest be part of the plan. The practice that matured in a Valley of Kings became ordinary good manners elsewhere, checklists, logs, quiet thresholds that say not today without apology. The idea of a curse, once useful to sell a thrill, finds less to do in a world that has learned to notice dust before it becomes damage and fatigue before it becomes a mistake. The story that began with a step in stone travels now as a way of behaving. You see it in small decisions: a guard who lets a queue breathe rather than push, a curator who chooses a replica when the original is tired, a technician who turns down the light and writes the time in a margin. You hear it in the way people talk when they leave a gallery. Softer words, fewer superlatives, more gratitude for what was allowed and what was spared. The spell at work is not in ink, it is in attention. The dead are kept by it, the living are steadied by it. In a landscape built for balance, the long tale of the discovery is simply this: we have learned to keep more by asking for less. If the old word lingers at the edge of the story, it stands now beside a set of practices that render it unnecessary. Doors are promises again, names anchor rather than threaten. Time moves as slowly as it needs to in rooms designed for sleep. And when the present must choose, open or not, display or rest, it knows that the quieter choice keeps the future rich. The valley taught that by example. We remember it every time we shade a lamp, number a tag, or let a closed door remain eloquent. Night gathers kindly over the western bank, and the cliffs return to their old habit of holding still. The doors in the rock are only numbers again. The stars painted on ceilings keep their small, faithful light. We have walked as far as we should for now, far enough to see that a curse was only a quick word for a slow arrangement, a way the living mistook protection for threat. The rooms themselves prefer another language, guardians that attend rather than warn, shrines that shelter rather than hide, a map designed so a person can keep their shape when breath is only memory. Tutankhamun's chambers taught the pace. They asked us to number before touching, to steady before lifting, to let a face appear without demanding surprise from it. The caches in the cliffs taught loyalty, the quiet work of rescue when older doors no longer held. Ramesses, travelling once more in our time, taught that care can cross borders without turning into spectacle. Even the stories that hurried ahead, cinema, rumour, the word that sells, learned, little by little, to walk more softly. In the end, attention proved to be the only spell that works. If the valley keeps anything for us tonight, it is balance. The ancients called it mat, and we felt it each time a lamp was shaded, each time a lid stayed closed, because rest is also a remedy. Science spoke in a gentle voice, consistent with likely, not proven, and found answers that did not disturb the rooms that offered them. Mystery was not the enemy. It was shade where the story could breathe. What remains uncertain can remain kind. So we will let the desert have the last line. The river's dark ribbon moves as it always has. Somewhere above, a jackal shrine watches in a room that needs nothing from us. Names are safe in their inks and linens. Doors are safe in their promises. If we carry anything away, let it be the habit of moving more slowly than our curiosity, and the ease that comes when fear is set down. A closed threshold is not a threat, it is a favor the past does for the future. Close your eyes and keep the geography of the valley the way the ceilings keep their stars. A path that turns, a chamber that listens, a face that waits without demand. Let the air grow still again. Let the sand settle its fine decisions. If a story wishes to go on, it will do so in a voice that does not wake the dark. For now, the promise of the door is enough. Rest comes easily here.